Crystal chandeliers hung high above the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, spilling delicate, shimmering light across the endless scarlet carpet that stretched from the towering entrance doors all the way to the sacred altar. Rows of carved wooden pews lined both sides of the grand aisle, filled with 200 formally dressed guests, every face blurred into a quiet, suffocating mass. Not a single whisper broke the heavy stillness. The summer heat clung thick and humid in the air, sticking to skin like damp silk. Sweat soaked through the white satin collar of my wedding suit, gluing the stiff fabric tight against my neck, making every shallow breath feel slow and labored, weighed down by an invisible pressure. I stood alone at the altar, my slender frame draped in an immaculately tailored white ceremony suit. My hands were encased in silky pure white gloves, a rigid tradition insisted upon by Dominic's mother, expensive and smooth against my skin yet cold and confining. Only moments earlier, my fingers had lifted gently, warm and hopeful, ready to lace through the fingers of the man I loved. Now those hands hung frozen mid-air, suspended in empty space, all my tender anticipation crumbling into cold, hollow nothingness. Beside me stood Dominic Reed, my fiancé, the sole heir of Reed Logistics' empire. He had not once glanced in my direction since the ceremony began. His tall, broad-shouldered figure was sharp and imposing in a bespoke black tuxedo, every thread perfectly pressed, every line tailored to ruthless precision. But his gaze was fixed entirely on the heavy gold watch wrapped around his wrist, his refined facial features hard and unyielding, his entire aura cold and distant. This was the man I had loved for 3 years, the man I had chosen against all odds, against class gaps and family opposition, the man I had trusted with every fragment of my future. Yet on our wedding day, there was no devotion in his eyes, no warmth, no joy at the life we were supposed to build together. There was only cold, calculated judgment. After an endless stretch of suffocating silence, he finally spoke. His deep baritone voice carried clearly through the lapel microphone pinned to his suit, every hollow syllable echoing coldly across the silent cathedral, sharp enough to slice straight through my chest. "I'm sorry, Liam. The merger has fallen through. This is bad business." There were no excuses, no hesitation, no flicker of guilt or sorrow in his eyes. His tone was flat, neutral, utterly emotionless, the exact tone he used when turning down an overpriced real estate deal or rejecting a low-profit corporate partnership. To him, this wedding, our 3-year relationship, every late night we'd spent together, every promise we'd whispered in the dark, every dream we'd woven side by side, none of it mattered. It was merely a business transaction, one he had decided to terminate the second the numbers stopped working in his favor. The second the last word left his lips, he turned away without a single backward glance, his broad shoulders rigid and unyielding. The golden wedding ring slipped off his finger, clattering against the polished marble floor with a sharp, gunshot-like sound. It spun in a slow, agonizing circle across the cold stone before finally settling at the toe of the Archbishop's formal shoe, a small, glinting symbol of everything we had lost before we'd even begun. I did not cry. There were no tears, no broken sobs, no dramatic collapse the way every watching guest expected. Instead, a heavy, crushing numbness flooded my chest, as if someone had poured wet concrete into my ribs, weighing my heart down until it could barely beat. The pain was sharp and suffocating, a physical ache rooted deep in my bones, far worse than any heartbreak I had ever imagined. I simply stood there, frozen, watching his retreating figure stride down the long red aisle, walking steadily toward the cathedral doors and away from me forever. His scent lingered in the air around me, the familiar, comforting cedar and rain-soaked ozone that had been my safe haven for 3 years, the scent of my alpha, my mate, my home. But in that moment, it curdled into something sharp and metallic, burning hot like scorched engine oil. It was the distinct, brutal scent of an alpha severing a pre-mated bond, a biological rejection that seared through my body, scraping raw every nerve and every hidden piece of my broken omega core. Whispers erupted instantly from the packed pews, low and buzzing, like a hive of waking hornets. Pity, mockery, quiet relief, and condescension rippled through the crowd in invisible waves. I scanned the crowd numbly and caught sight of Dominic's father, a cold, austere man who had always regarded me as nothing more than a flawed, disposable inconvenience, a dented, worthless can on a perfect supermarket shelf. He nodded faintly at his wife, a quiet, satisfied gesture that spoke volumes. He had always known I was not worthy of his son, of the Reed empire, of the life Dominic had once promised me. I was nothing but a middle-class omega, a freelance graphic designer with no prestigious family lineage, no generational trust fund, no powerful connections to elevate Dominic's corporate status. I had nothing but my love, my loyalty, and the quiet, steady devotion I had given him freely for 3 long years. Dominic had once fought for me. He had argued with his parents, yelled at the board members, defied his family's expectations, and sworn publicly that he would choose me over the empire, over wealth, over status, over everything. I had believed him blindly, wholeheartedly, stupidly. I had thought love could outweigh legacy, that devotion could override corporate pressure, that we could overcome every obstacle side by side. But the moment his empire threatened to crumble, the moment his position as heir hung in the balance, I had become the first sacrifice. A warm, gentle presence appeared at my side. Sam, my best friend since childhood, hovered cautiously, his hand hovering just above my arm, too afraid to touch me, too afraid to trigger the obvious agony rippling through my body. Liam, he murmured softly, his voice tight with grief and rage. Come on. Let's leave through the back. Don't give them the satisfaction. I shook my head, my throat dry and scratchy, my voice cracking on a thin, pathetic sound. Yet I lifted my chin higher, straightening my trembling shoulders, forcing every ounce of broken dignity I had left into my posture. I walked in through the front, I said steadily. I'm leaving through the front too. I stripped the delicate white silk gloves from my hands in one sharp motion, dropping them carelessly onto the cold altar stone, abandoning the last trace of the perfect, obedient Omega bride they'd wanted me to be. Then I began to walk. Every step down the long aisle was a brutal physical effort. The air in the cathedral pressed thick and heavy against my skin, weighing me down, suffocating me with every judgmental stare, every quiet whisper, every hidden look of scorn and sympathy. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the stained glass windows above the exit doors, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, refusing to let them see how utterly shattered I was beneath my calm facade. I did not allow myself to breathe freely until I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the humid July city air, leaving the lies, the humiliation, and the broken remnants of my love story behind me. A sleek black limousine waited curbside, paid for entirely by Dominic, meant to carry us to our wedding reception and our new life together. I walked straight past it without a single glance, raising a hand to hail a generic yellow taxi, choosing ordinary anonymity over the luxurious cage I had almost locked myself into forever. By the time I unlocked the door to the apartment we had shared for 3 years, the numbing shock had faded completely, leaving only raw, unfiltered agony in its wake. The pain was no longer just emotional, it was biological, brutal and unrelenting. The pre-mating bond we had built slowly over years of shared touches, shared scents, shared nights and secrets was being violently severed by his public rejection. Every cell in my Omega body screamed in protest, my glands throbbing with a sharp, burning ache that pulsed through my neck, my chest, my bones. My biology mourned the loss of my alpha before my heart could even process the betrayal. I kicked off my immaculate white wedding suit, tossing the expensive fabric carelessly into the bedroom corner, no longer wanting anything that carried the scent or the memory of Dominic Reed. I stumbled into the bathroom, bracing my shaking hands on the cold porcelain sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Pale, exhausted skin, hollow brown eyes ringed with deep dark circles, a face stripped of all hope and warmth. I looked frail, broken, completely unraveled. A sharp, twisting cramp gripped my lower abdomen, sudden and intense, and I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles blanched white, fighting through the wave of physical discomfort. My gaze drifted down to the small wastebasket sitting beside the vanity. Half buried beneath a crumpled tissue was a plastic pregnancy test, the one I had taken at 5 o'clock that morning, hidden carefully from everyone, including Dominic. Two clear pink lines stared back at me. I had planned to tell him tonight, at the wedding reception. I had written out a whole quiet speech in my head, soft and hopeful, telling him we were starting a family, that our love was growing into something bigger, that every sacrifice we'd made had been worth it. I'd dreamed of his smile, his quiet joy, the way he would hold me close and promise to love our little family forever. It was all a stupid, naive fantasy. I turned away from the test, from my reflection, from the future I had imagined so vividly. I dragged my suitcase down from the top closet shelf, packing only my own worn jeans, faded sweaters, my beat-up laptop, and the few books that had always belonged solely to me. I left every expensive gift Dominic had ever given me, designer clothes, luxury watches, fine jewelry, untouched, abandoning every trace of his charity, his wealth, his half-hearted affection. I grabbed the emergency cash I had hidden away in an old coffee can, my bottle of heavy-duty scent suppressants, and nothing more. I paused at the apartment door, glancing back at the sterile, perfect space that had never truly felt like home, a space saturated entirely with his cedar and ozone scent, a constant reminder of the love that had just destroyed me. I set my apartment keys neatly on the kitchen counter. Then I walked out, and I never looked back. Chapter 2, 4 Years of Quiet Survival. Seattle was gray, damp, and endlessly loud with the patter of cold rain. It was perfect. Rain was a natural scent dampener, washing away residual pheromones, blurring traces of identity, swallowing people whole into the misty concrete landscape of the city. In Seattle, an unbonded omega with no pack, no mate, no family protection could disappear completely, and that was exactly what I needed. 4 years was long enough to heal from a broken bond, long enough to build thick calluses over shattered nerves, long enough to forget the taste of expensive champagne and luxurious affection, long enough to rebuild a life entirely separate from Dominic Reed. 4 years was long enough to learn how to survive, quietly and invisibly. Dad! The toaster's smoking. I jolted awake abruptly, my forehead peeling away from the cheap laminate kitchen table where I'd drifted off mid-morning routine. Grit blurred my tired eyes as I blinked rapidly, pulling myself back to the present, to the small, cramped one-bedroom Seattle apartment that had been my safe haven for 4 years. Toby stood on his tiptoes beside the counter, dressed in faded dinosaur pajamas, his small sticky finger pointed urgently at the smoking appliance. A thin plume of black smoke curled upward from the 2-slot toaster, thick and acrid. Shit, I muttered under my breath, scrambling quickly to my feet. I yanked the plug from the wall socket and popped the lever up, revealing 2 completely charred, unrecognizable squares of toast, blackened and crisp beyond saving. Watch your language, Liam, I reminded myself automatically, a quiet daily mantra. Toby giggled beside me, a bright, bell-like sound that instantly softened the tight tension coiled constantly across my shoulders. My 4-year-old son had messy, unruly jet-black hair that refused to stay combed, and pale blue eyes, exact replicas of Dominic's eyes. Looking at Toby every single day was a bittersweet, endless contradiction. I loved him with every single piece of my soul, more than life itself. But every time I stared into those familiar blue eyes, every time I caught the faint, inherent strength in his small frame, I was punched straight back into the pain of 4 years prior, reminded relentlessly of the man who had abandoned us both before he'd even known we existed. No toast today, buddy, I said softly, tossing the blackened bread into the trash can. Just cereal. Okay. Toby trotted eagerly toward the fridge, his small feet thudding heavily against the worn linoleum floor. He was slightly small for his age, but he moved with uncoordinated, unshakable confidence, a subtle, early sign of the alpha he would one day become. His scent hadn't fully emerged yet, still only the warm, sweet milky fragrance of a young pup. But underneath that innocent sweetness, I could always detect faint, lingering undertones, crisp, wild, outdoorsy hints of cedar and storm ozone. The same scent that had once been my home, and later my ruin. I tried never to dwell on it. I poured him a bowl of generic cornflakes and settled across the small kitchen table, watching him eat while I completed my quiet, necessary morning ritual. I opened an orange plastic pill bottle and shook 2 chalky white suppressant tablets into my palm. These were heavy-duty, off-brand scent blockers, cheap and unregulated, strong enough to completely neutralize my natural omega pheromones. They gave me constant, throbbing migraines, left me fatigued and irritable, and had slowly damaged my liver over years of consistent use, but they worked. They kept me invisible. Unbonded omegas with pups were vulnerable targets in this world, easily hunted, easily exploited, easily pressured into unwanted bonds by dominant alphas seeking compliant partners. The pills masked my natural sweet, distress-tinged vanilla pheromones, turning my scent completely neutral, blank, unnoticeable. They turned me from a vulnerable omega into just another faceless civilian in the crowd. I swallowed the tablets dry, wincing faintly at the bitter chalky taste coating my tongue. "We taking the big bus today?" Toby asked, milk dribbling gently down his small chin. "Yep," I smiled faintly, wiping his chin with a napkin. "Big bus for you to daycare, then work for me." My work was a monotonous data entry cubicle job at Apex Freight, a mid-sized shipping and logistics company near the Seattle docks. My days consisted entirely of tracking shipping containers, updating spreadsheets full of endless numbers, and replying to angry, impatient emails from logistics managers frustrated by delayed auto parts stuck in Oakland harbors. It was mind-numbing, repetitive, unglamorous work. It paid $18 an hour, barely enough to cover our monthly rent on the rattling, drafty apartment, Toby's expensive asthma medication, groceries, and basic survival costs. It was just enough to survive. And survival was all I had ever wanted for the past 4 years. We bundled up against the cold morning drizzle, and I held Toby's small gloved hand tightly as we waited at the neighborhood bus stop. Damp winter chill seeped straight through my thin coat, sinking into my bones, but I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with every passing commuter, staying small and unobtrusive. I dropped Toby off at a local daycare run by a stern but kind beta woman who had known us for years, who never asked questions about Toby's absent father, never pried into my hidden past. Then I walked the remaining 6 blocks to my office building, my shoes splashing softly through rain puddles on the concrete sidewalk. The air inside the Apex Freight office was stale and stagnant, thick with the smell of burnt office coffee and damp carpet. I logged quietly into my work computer, slipped on my headset, and prepared to vanish into 8 hours of mindless routine, the same routine that had kept me safe, hidden, and undisturbed for 4 straight years. "Hey, Liam." I looked up from my blank spreadsheet to find my supervisor, Greg, hovering awkwardly beside my cubicle. Greg was a middle-aged, balding alpha who constantly sweated through his cheap button-down shirts, perpetually nervous and overworked. He looked more anxious than usual today, his shoulders tense, his gaze shifting nervously around the office. "Morning, Greg. What's up?" I asked evenly, keeping my tone neutral and calm. "Mandatory all-hands meeting in the break room in 10 minutes, he rushed out, lowering his voice slightly. "Upper management's here." I frowned faintly. Upper management never visited our small satellite branch. We were largely ignored by corporate headquarters, left to operate quietly as long as we met our monthly quotas. "Did we mess up a quota?" I asked quietly. "No," Greg muttered, leaning in closer, his nervous sour apple scent drifting toward me. "Rumor is we got bought out. Big acquisition firm from the East Coast. They're here to restructure the entire branch." A sharp, cold spike of anxiety pierced straight through my chest. Restructure always meant layoffs. I had exactly $82 left in my checking account. Rent was due in 4 days. Toby's asthma inhaler was running low. I could not afford to lose this job. "Okay," I said steadily, masking my panic behind a calm facade. "I'll be there." 10 minutes later, I squeezed into the cramped break room, standing tucked into the far back corner beside a vending machine, pressing my back flat against the cool metal surface. 50 employees stood shoulder to shoulder beneath flickering fluorescent lights, every face tight with quiet stress and uncertainty. Everyone knew what a corporate acquisition meant for small local branches. The second the break room door opened, the air shifted entirely. The stale coffee and carpet stagnation was violently pushed aside by a heavy, overwhelming, suffocating alpha pressure, raw, unfiltered, dominant, impossible to ignore. It hung thick in the air, pressing down on every person in the room, making every beta and low-ranking alpha shift uneasily. Then the scent hit me. Rain-soaked cedar. Sharp storm ozone. The faint, burnt undertone of hot engine oil. My breath caught violently in my throat. The edges of my vision grayed out instantly, dizziness washing over me in a brutal wave. My body recognized that scent before my mind could process the truth, before my eyes could confirm what my terrified heart already knew. A phantom, burning ache flared to life in the scent gland on my neck, the old severed bond throbbing violently after 4 years of quiet dormancy. The pain was sharp and raw, identical to the day he'd rejected me at the altar, and I bit down hard on my tongue to stifle a gasp, my nails digging sharply into my palms. No. No, no, no. I shrank back further against the vending machine, pressing my entire body into the cold metal surface, trying to make myself smaller, invisible, gone. Good morning, everyone. The voice drifted across the silent room, deep and familiar, deeper and rougher around the edges than I remembered, but unmistakably his, the voice I had memorized, dreamed of, cried over, and spent 4 years trying to erase completely from my memory. I forced my eyes to lift a tiny, trembling inch. Dominic Reed stood at the front of the break room. He wore a tailored charcoal designer suit, crisp and flawless, worth more money than I earned in 2 full years of grueling cubicle work. The soft, arrogant youthfulness I had known 4 years ago was completely gone, replaced by sharp, hardened facial lines, a mature, commanding jaw, and quiet exhaustion lingering in the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked older, colder, infinitely more powerful, but still devastatingly familiar. His posture commanded the entire room, every eye locked automatically on his figure. I'm Dominic Reed, he continued, his tone authoritative, businesslike, completely devoid of warmth or personal feeling. Reed Acquisitions officially took full ownership of Apex Freight at midnight. I'm here to assure you the transition will be swift and efficient. All departments will undergo full evaluation this week. His gaze swept slowly across the crowd, left to right, scanning every face in the room with sharp, assessing precision. I stopped breathing entirely. I prayed desperately that my cheap drugstore suppressants were still working, that my scent remained completely neutral, that he would not recognize me, would not see me, would glance past me and move on. I pulled my hood slightly forward, tucking my chin down behind my jacket collar, hiding my face as best I could. I needed him to leave. I needed to finish this workday, pick up Toby, go home, pack our things, and run again, farther this time, somewhere he would never find us. For years of quiet routine, for years of suppression and survival, for years of building a safe, hidden life for my child and myself, I could not let him destroy it all in a single second. Dominic's speech was short, sharp, and corporate, filled with empty buzzwords meant to soothe anxious employees while quietly threatening everyone's job security. The second he finished speaking, the room erupted into quiet, stressed murmurs, people shifting nervously, preparing to return to their desks. I turned immediately, head down, moving fast toward the side exit, desperate to escape his presence. You there? The gray jacket. My blood turned to ice in my veins. I kept walking, refusing to stop, refusing to acknowledge him. Excuse me. I'm speaking to you. A firm, warm hand clamped down on my shoulder. The physical contact was like an electric shock searing straight through my jacket, burning into my skin, triggering every suppressed memory, every broken nerve, every lingering fragment of our old bond. The heat of his palm was familiar, terrifying, intoxicating, and agonizing all at once. I froze completely. By now, most of the employees had fled the break room, leaving only Greg, a few of Dominic's executive assistants, and the two of us standing in the quiet space. Dominic's voice dropped lower, impatient and sharp, right beside my ear. I asked for the Western Seaboard Logistics files. Are you deaf, or just ignoring me? I pulled myself together in an instant, stepping sharply backward, shrugging his hand off my shoulder with deliberate, cold force. I lifted my head and met his eyes directly, my gaze flat, empty, and unyielding. Dominic's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. The impatience and sharp annoyance on his face shattered instantly, cracking apart into pure, unbridled shock. All the color drained completely from his face, leaving him pale and stunned, his body rigid with disbelief. His pale blue eyes, Toby's eyes, blown wide, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. He did not speak. He did not move. I could see the muscles in his jaw working frantically, desperately trying to form words, trying to process the impossible fact that I was standing right in front of him, alive, working in his newly acquired company, hidden in the city he'd spent 4 years searching. My voice was perfectly flat, monotone, devoid of any emotion as I spoke, proud of how steady I sounded despite the chaos raging inside me. I'm not the file clerk assigned to that department, Mr. Reed. If you need the Western Seaboard files, you can ask Greg. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have shipping containers to track. His name tumbled from my lips, foreign and cold, no longer the warm, affectionate nickname I'd whispered 1,000 times in the dark. I used his professional title, creating an impenetrable stranger's distance between us. Liam, he breathed out. It was not a spoken word. It was a ragged, torn exhalation, scraping raw across his throat, broken and shaky, full of 4 years of suppressed grief and frantic longing. He took a stumbling step forward, his dominant alpha instincts flaring violently, his scent spiking with frantic, desperate distress, rolling over me in overwhelming waves. I stepped 2 clear steps backward, solidifying the space between us, refusing to let him close the gap. I turned my back on him without another word and walked away. I did not run. I walked steadily, deliberately, with every ounce of cold dignity I had left. But I could feel his eyes burning into my spine, hot and unrelenting, all the way down the hallway, every step I took away from him. I made it to the men's restroom before the panic attack crashed over me full force. I locked the stall door, sank down onto the grimy tile floor, and pulled my knees tight to my chest, gasping for air that refused to fill my paralyzed lungs. His scent lingered on my jacket, on my skin, trapped in my nose, invading every sense. One single touch, one single glance after 4 years of perfect hiding, and the fortress I had built from routine, suppression, and quiet survival was cracking apart at the seams. My buried omega core, suppressed for years by chemicals and sheer willpower, thrashed violently inside me, whimpering for the alpha who had abandoned and broken us. I hated it. I hated my biology for remembering him. I hated my body for still craving his warmth, his scent, his bond after everything he'd put me through. He had bought the entire company. Just to find me. And now, my quiet, safe, hidden life was over.